Hello and welcome to Coffee with Friends. This is an event for the Monroe County Public Library, and it's presented by the Friends of the Library. Now, I'm Patsy Ron. I'm a member of the board of the Friends of the Library Foundation, and I'll be hosting today's event. Now, for this event, we are delighted to have Nate Powell with us. And he is an award-winning graphic novelist, and we will be discussing his newest book, which is titled Save It for Later, Promises, Parenthood, and the Urgency of Protest. So there will be time at the end of the program for questions and answers from everybody. So please, if you have a question for Nate, type it into the chat section over to the right. There you go. And be sure to send it to the everybody designation. I'd like to remind you that we are recording this to be played later on the library's YouTube page. So if you do not wish to have your photo up there, just go ahead and click on the video icon and it'll not show your image. And a couple of announcements before we begin. First of all, Nate's book is available at the Friends of the Library bookstore, and it's only $20, which is a great buy, and they're signed, and he has put the most beautiful signature in them. So please, if you're interested, go and get a copy because it's really a wonderful book to have. Also, Hopscotch Coffee has again partnered with us for Coffee with Friends. You can go there and get a 15% discount throughout the month of May, and they're located on the Beeline Trail, open from 8 to 6 daily. And they have another location. The Beeline Trail is at 235 West Dodds, and they're also at 212 North Madison Street. So if you're going to order online, just use the code MCPL, like Monroe County Public Library. And if you're ordering in person, just say, I'm a friend of the library, and you'll get your discount. So I would like to introduce our guest, Nate Powell. This is a bit of a long bio, but it's worth hearing, and so enjoy. Nate Powell is the first cartoonist ever to win the National Book Award. He began self-publishing at the age of 14 and graduated from School of Visual Arts in 2000. His work includes his new graphic memoir essays, Save It for Later, and civil rights icon John Lewis's legendary March Trilogy, as well as many others. Now, Powell's work has also received a Robert F. Kennedy Book Award, 3 Eisner Awards. Now, Nate, help me on pronunciation. 2 Ignatz Awards, CXC Transformative Work Award, the Michael L. Prince Award, a Coretta Scott King Author Award, 4 YALSA, YALSA Great Graphic Novels for Teens Selections, the Walter Dean Myers Award, and he is a 2-time finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. Powell has discussed his work at the United Nations, as well as on MSNBC's The Rachel Maddow Show, CNN, PBS, and Free Speech TV. His animated artwork in the Southern Poverty Law Center's Selma, The Bridge to the Ballot, has reached over 1 million students in 50,000 schools across the country. And from 1999 to 2009, Powell worked full-time providing support for adults with developmental disabilities alongside his cartooning efforts. He also managed an underground record label, Harlan Records, for 16 years and performed in punk bands Sophie, Nun Squad, and Universe. And best of all for us, he lives in Bloomington, Indiana. So welcome, Nate. It's a delight to have you here. So what we'll do today is Nate's going to give a presentation about his work and the new book. And it will be followed by some discussion between Nate and I for a few questions. And then we'll open up the Q&A to everybody. So again, if when he's giving his presentation, you think of a question, just type it into that chat area. All right, Nate, handing it over to you.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, for being here. I'm Nate. I live here Bloomington. I'm originally from Little Rock, Arkansas. This is your time, so thanks for choosing it to spend it all together. I don't want to waste your time. So whether you've read my book or not, basically I've got just a quick slideshow with images and panels from the book to sort of give a brief rundown of my process in the development, as well as kind of parallel experiences that went into making the book. And I'll try to wrap that up as quickly as I can so we can get to the more interesting part, which is asking questions, discussing things, and going from there. All right, so let me share my screen real fast. All righty. Okay, is that working for everybody? Good, okay. So yeah, this book is Save It for Later. It's kind of a hybrid of more subjective memoir style storytelling with slightly more objective, more researched essay components. And more or less, this documents and processes a lot of my and my family's experiences living through, the last 5 years or so. A lot of that is specific to raising kids who are young and quickly growing into a world, and their worldview is expanding, and basically going through the processes of how to equip them at their level with some social and political considerations of immense importance, but also kind of knowing where I, as a parent, am going to fall short, catching myself with my contradictions. And a lot of it has to do with intergenerational reckoning, not just my generation and my kids' generation, but specifically, a lot of that goes backwards between Generation X and the baby boomers who raised us. So I make a lot of books. These are most of my full-length books that I did before Save It for Later. Importantly, I do both fiction and nonfiction. So Swallow Me Whole, Come Again, these are books which are straight fiction. However, they process a lot of social and political components, but it's kind of mashed up into mixes of like magical realism, horror, fairy tales, relationship stories as a way of speaking with truth about the world we live in. In the case of the March trilogy, this is straight historical nonfiction and memoir simultaneously. With the other three books, The Silence of Our Friends and Any Empire specifically, these books are like The Silence of Our Friends is essentially a nonfiction book, which served as a primer, I guess, for my work on the March trilogy. It is a period piece that takes place in Texas against a backdrop of a forgotten chapter of civil rights movement history, but it is just barely fictionalized in order to allow the story itself to fit within one book. And then Any Empire and Two Dead are good examples of works of fiction which were built around a historical framework. Any Empire being more autobiographical and Two Dead being set against historical events in my hometown of Little Rock, Arkansas. So I do a lot of bouncing back and forth between fiction and nonfiction. And my work on each side of the fence kind of helps inform and enrich my storytelling when I move back and forth. I started a long time ago doing shorter nonfiction essays and autobiographical comics, but frankly, I haven't really been interested in telling stories like that in over a decade. And I really had no intention of making the book that became Save It for Later by the time I finished the March trilogy. I really wanted to return to my home of doing weirdo, magical realist novels. So I guess the origin story for Save It for Later simply has to do with my older daughter in particular, kind of being raised from birth, literally from birth, surrounded by these images of protest as I was working on the March trilogy, but also in particular, as her eyes were opening and her worldview was getting bigger, particularly between 2014 and 2017, as we experienced a much more concentrated, hard rightward shift in American society and politics, which soon became part of a very concentrated authoritarian power grab. So there's a good portion of Save It for Later, which focuses specifically on how my family's experience being so close to the history and the documentation of history through March helped influence and shape not only my kids' experience of the world, of their community, and of our nation as a whole, but also really influenced and impacted my experiences as a parent. I feel very lucky that even though I made these books, I was also able to enjoy them as a reader and experience them through a very different parental framework. In particular, it sort of forced me into a position in which I was constantly trying to be mindful of what my kids' worldview looked like at the time, even as young as a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old. And so there's a lot of bounce back in the memoir sections of Save It for Later. There are a lot of more private, subjective experiences, which I documented in kind of a therapeutic way. Like the reason why I started making a lot of these memoir sections of Save It for Later is because by the end of 2017, it was very clear to me that after just a year under this very rapid authoritarian power grab with what seemed like 100 dumpster fires burning at once, I recognized amongst most people I knew, as well as within myself, that there was often a hesitation and assumption that maybe there wasn't enough bandwidth to really share some of the more private, subjective, personal and emotional experiences living under this authoritarian power grab. Whether, it's this notion that, I need to be putting my energy towards much more pressing concerns. I don't need to be bothering anyone by kind of airing what it's like to be losing sleep, to feel the way that this kind of stress, anxiety, dread, terror, depression, sadness is impacting not only living through your life and the way it affects your family, your neighbors, your community, but also how that impacts your ability to get in there and do the work you think you need to be doing. Once I realized that this is very much a part of normalization under authoritarianism, is losing not just that sense of space to air some of these more subjective personal concerns, but also sort of downplaying the significance of those feelings and living within that state, and how quickly that can kind of get smoothed over, and all of a sudden there's no time to process any of that. So by the beginning of 2018, I realized that there were these moments, these memories, and this vividness that was already being lost. So in the spring of 2018, I went to my agent, and I had this idea for a very quick, raw, all memoir book that might just be 96 pages. I wanted to finish it in 6 months and get it out right away. And basically I wound up writing and breaking down the first couple of chapters within 2 days. However, another dimension of living under an authoritarian regime is that things just keep happening and keep happening so fast. So in order to speak about the world and in order to organize my thoughts, the scope and the scale of the book had to naturally move along with it, had to evolve and change shape and kind of expand. So I had these other kind of essay comics that I'll get to in a minute that I quickly realized were very much a part of the same book, which is when the book started to gain its final shape as a mix of these subjective experiences and this more objective storytelling. Oh, whoops. There we go. Okay, so importantly, I think one, especially speaking for my generation and for baby boomers, another important theme that's in Save It for Later has to do with the failures of multi-generational assumptions, which have been carried largely since the end of World War II, and specifically throughout much of white America. And a lot of that simply has to do with the assumption that in the end, things will work out, that there is an inevitability of social progress, that the arc of the moral universe, you know, eventually bends towards justice on its own. And so as time went on, it became more acutely obvious to me that while, you know, Generation X certainly had baggage to carry through it as well, but my parents' generation was having a considerable amount of difficulty adjusting to the basic reality that the old rules no longer applied. And so having faith in a system functioning as usual was becoming something that was very much part and parcel of allowing this authoritarian power grab to expand. And so over the course of assembling these comics for Save It for Later, a lot of it had to do with kind of moving and processing the world in real time, reckoning with old ways of discussing society, discussing power, discussing inequality, and also how to cover how I process that with my children. A lot of this, you know, documents my family's experiences breaking down really complicated social and political issues at a much simpler level that my kids can process based on where their worldview is at the time. But also understanding the limits of that knowledge, kind of balancing that with your parental responsibility not to scare your kids, but also knowing where the limitation of protecting your kids from being afraid is, and understanding where there is a component of privilege involved in making the assumption that your kids shouldn't be bothered by what you perceive as social and political issues that your kids likely are already picking up on. And over the past 5 years, especially as my older daughter has aged from 4 to 9 years, it's been astounding and really encouraging to notice just how much she absorbs all the time, and recognizing that a key part of this process of equipping your kids to handle this very foreboding future, the fight of their lives, simply has to do with being ready for when your kid inevitably asks a question, because they will. The other component of Save It for Later, this falls under closer to the essay portion of it, mixes a lot of those personal experiences with broader observations about pop culture warning signs. A lot of this really gets into surface elements of consumer culture. And you know, like being a comic book nerd, I lean more heavily towards the nerdy end of the spectrum here because I think it's very relevant. One of the essay portions is called Pecking Order, and it takes us back 10 years to 2011 and allows us to kind of take a look within the comic book and cosplay nerd communities. You know, part of my job is going to all different kinds of comic conventions and pop culture conventions, and recognizing that, you know, there are components here where throughout the book, whenever possible, I try to make myself the idiot and try to highlight the ways in which I'm contradicting myself, the ways in which I'm being the reactionary contrarian who's getting in the way of real understanding, the ways in which I might be my own worst enemy or my family's worst enemy. But when you get into nerd spaces, like a huge comic convention, you know, I cover sort of this personal process where cosplayers who are dedicated to this sort of like social network and social apparatus of you know, dressing up in character that's very much intertwined with comics-centered pop culture. There's definitely, like, as one kind of nerd, I recognize there's a vicious part in myself that wants to distance myself from other kinds of nerds, where deep down inside I feel they're lesser kinds of nerds. And being called out on that and recognizing just how messed up that is. And then at the same time, 10 years ago, having still a semi-regular occurrence at these larger comic conventions of the smug, self-satisfied, contrarian Nazi cosplayer, which is something that reliably would happen about 50% of the time. And basically, it covers the experience of looking back at the degree of plausible deniability at dressing up as perhaps a character, perhaps not, that was a Nazi officer, sort of waiting to stoke the fires that were in this microcosm of society at a comic convention, and basically stifling my own urge to ask this guy questions or speak out, letting someone else do the work for me instead, but basically being like, you know, what's the worst that can happen? Not recognizing that this is, in fact, the tunnel at the end of the light, and seeing the ways in which this kind of toxic, smug, contrarian nerddom, masked in plausible deniability, in a very real way, specifically through 2014's Gamergate fiasco, sort of provided a set of tools and tactics for social interaction and social media performance, which paved the way for the authoritarianism that we have survived over the previous 5 years. The second part of that is maybe my most widely read comic ever, which has now been reprinted in Save It for Later. It's called About Face, which is basically about the normalization of paramilitary and fascist presence in our society via consumer culture, cool stuff to buy. It traces a lot of symbology from the Punisher skull to the gradual incremental loss of color in the American flag, moving from specifically the ways in which the flag, the Punisher skull, the return of facial hair as a hypermasculine style component, and the way that in 2016, 2017, the return of all Black custom detailed trucks and cars made, in my opinion, a very strong statement that paralleled with this authoritarian power grab. A lot of this has to do with style and aesthetic kind of trickling down from active duty military aesthetic into paramilitary, private security, mercenary forces, law enforcement, and finally into civilian pop culture. And this sort of turns back around and reprocesses what was in pecking order about the plausible deniability of a lot of these obvious symbols aligning themselves with white supremacy, with fascism, and with authoritarianism, but specifically because they had reached a pop cultural escape velocity, so that they were very much just a part of our bumper culture aesthetic, our avatar aesthetic, cheap t-shirts you can buy at Walmart. This, again, the plausible deniability provides the shield which allows these explicitly authoritarian symbols to embed themselves very deeply in our culture. This was an essay, by the way, that took a hell of a time to get someone to agree to publish from a respectable outlet online. And I was just one day away from publishing it myself, however I could, hoping maybe 50 people would read it, when thankfully a friend of mine who had just started up an independent media venture was like, I will give it a good home. And lo and behold, a couple of millions of clicks and views and reads later, it has become my most widely read comic of all time. So I'm very thankful for that turn of good fortune, which sort of allowed an audience. Now I finished all of the book except for one chapter in late January of 2020. And so there is a chapter I had to do just in the final months before the book was sent to the printer, which covers 2020. A lot of the process here, is very much focused on, like a lot of the rest of the book, experiences which seem very acutely personal and intimate to each of us, but which are widely, broadly shared. I'd even say across most of the political spectrum, not just isolation and grief and the loss of social space for mourning and for processing a reality, but even in terms of airing fear, anxiety, doubt, dread. These like in a hyper partisan, hyper divisive society today, these are still not hyper partisan experiences we had. Like people from the far left to the center right were experiencing so much of this at the same time and in the same words or without the same words. So a lot of it focuses on the virus, my family's personal experiences, knowing they were echoed amongst many people, but also recognizing that one of the choices I had to make as an author of this book was, if the point is that so many of these experiences were so broadly shared amongst so many people, sort of having enough faith in a reader to not only know what I'm talking about at a certain level, but to project their own experiences onto what I'm communicating in my comics. And so it's a question of scope, a question of knowing that you shouldn't be trying to fit everything that happened into this book. It's having a leap of faith in the reader to meet you halfway. And so as this chapter was wrapped up, I finished it in late August of 2020. And so this also comes at the end of losing my friend and collaborator, the great Congressman John Lewis, in July of 2020. And it took me quite a while to process the reality of losing him. And it was very strange. This is really where, like, I have a lot of friends who, across the nation who had gotten the virus, and a lot of them had family members and loved ones who they had lost to the virus. I was fortunate in that I still do not have a first-person friend who I've lost to the virus. So going back to July, the loss of Congressman Lewis really highlighted to me in a very specific and in a kind of privileged way, highlighted to me just how much of the social grieving process we had lost. But living in a world that was shut down and losing these bigger public spaces to share grief together. And so I did a lot of just like sitting in the summer heat in my backyard, trying to have a personal experience of loss, but also feeling the loss of Congressman Lewis in a much larger social sense as a hero of mine, as well as a friend. I did not want to include those experiences in this book because I really did not want it to seem like that was exploiting his loss. However, after about a month, this is part of just like spending my life drawing comics. I realized that what I needed to do personally to process his loss was put it on the page. And 5 days later, those pages were done. And again, comics did their thing. The magic worked. So I present those pages in this chapter as well. And I guess the final focus here simply has to do with this intergenerational reckoning, specifically between my generation and my parents' generation. And these errors of faith, which especially from 2016, 2017, I would grapple with regularly with my parents, seeming inability to process that the old rules do not apply, that simply getting caught committing crimes or defying the Constitution did not mean that consequences were imminent. And sort of trying to point out gently that these were symptoms of democracy being broken in broad daylight, that it's not a matter of people seeing or knowing that it's being broken. It's a matter of not having consequences, which allows that authoritarian power grab to thrive. And some of this stuff reflects back on questions that I thankfully have been able to work through with my parents starting back in childhood. A lot of it, being a G.I. Joe kid in a military family in the Reagan era, and being fortunate enough to have a dad who's very thoughtful, who was able to voice his reservations and a lot of the contradictions, as well as the value to military service, and communicating it at my level to this like G.I. Joe gung-ho child of the 80s. but also kind of reckoning back on some of those intergenerational failures, holding on to the notion that allowing space for fascism to thrive is evidence of a thriving open society. Something I heard a lot in my having philosophical, conversations and arguments with my dad growing up, like, that's the thing about freedom of speech. Without these hateful people being able to be hateful, we wouldn't be free, would we? Thankfully, we have been forced over the past 5 years to really accelerate and reevaluate thinking on a broader level about what it means to platform white supremacists, what it means to provide space for fascists, and what it means in terms of the survival of democracy itself. I also kind of break down my own thoughts on what I think is a harmful misconception about the progressive college town like Bloomington being a bubble or an oasis or a haven, which is something that I've referred to Bloomington since I've lived here, using all of those terms. By seeing our community and its surrounding area more clearly every day, it occurs to me that the nominally progressive college town isn't a bubble. In fact, it's the opposite. It is America in microcosm. And the dynamic tension between what we think of consciously when you say college town and the community surrounding it and in which it's embedded produces a much more accurate view of America at large. And so a lot of the impetus for so much of the content of this book, and specifically about face, has to do with the incredible and terrifying prevalence of very obvious white supremacists and dangerous paramilitary presence here in South Central Indiana, here in Bloomington, here in our neighborhoods. And all it takes is just looking with eyes that can see. And trusting that symbols have meaning, and sort of trying to shake off the very calculated efforts to create plausible deniability for very obvious, organized, coordinated efforts to gain strength, in paramilitary circles and to advance the ideas of white supremacy. So, I mean, a lot of this kind of ends with the idea of reckoning with what it means to trust. If like the only way forward really is building back to a point in which we are able to trust the efforts and trust the intentions of our neighbors. At the same time, it means doubling down and reassessing that lines are also drawn for a reason. And so that doesn't mean producing an environment of universal forgiveness. It means standing by principles, and it means, understanding that trust, comes with risk and with sacrifice, but it means that there are entirely valid justifications, whether it's for cutting people out of your life or whether it's understanding that a fascist is always dangerous, whether it's understanding that cosplaying fascists are just fascists. These are the takeaways which are going to allow democracy to survive at all. So it sort of presents us with a challenge at the end about what each of us will do and how much each of us needs to be able to rely on other people to pick up the slack where we are unable to or choose not to, but then recognizing the reciprocity there, that it's our responsibility to pick up the slack whenever we can, when we know that other people won't be there in turn. So that's where I've got you here on the slideshow. I'll stop sharing my screen. Here we go, there we go. All right, so more or less, I guess we can just turn it over, if you'd like, to a discussion. Do you want me to re-host Chris? Okay. All right, let me find Chris here. I don't see Chris up on my little Oh, hello, Chris. All right. There you go. Oh, yes. Can you hear me? Okay, Chris, you're muted.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Patsy's muted.
All right. Yeah. Would you guys like to go through the process of going through questions? Here we go. Here's one from Sean Boyd. All right. I love the way you compose pages, breaking the bonds of traditional panel structure. When you approach a page, do you just let that structure happen organically, or do you plan out a page's composition first? Excellent question. Also, I appreciate people asking comics-centered questions. Especially with like a topical book, you know, all of these are important questions, but sometimes the medium of choice gets extra downplayed along the way. So thank you. Yes. Okay. So I plan out the page's composition first. Here we go. This is a totally separate book I'm working on now, but I generally just do my thumbnails super small, just a couple inches high per page. And as I'm writing, like, you know, I wrote Save It for Later in just like a cheap journal, just like this. A lot of the prose parts, I would just kind of write them in a cascading poem-like format going down the page. And when it came down to breaking it down into small thumbnail versions of each page, that's primarily to get the page flow working at a satisfactory level, making sure there's room for all the text and everything. But really, that's where I work out compositional issues. And that's where I worry about composition more than anything else. One thing, you know, like there's a lot of work that goes into comics. It's like, it's not rewarding in terms of like the time, money payoff. It's rewarding because you love comics. But what I've learned is the more you are able to make changes quickly early on, the more, you know, a stitch in time will save 9. So by moving from the thumbnails to, this is a rejected kind of rough pencil page for Save It for Later, that might be 15 minutes spent just roughly penciling this in and then lettering it. And then I decided to recompose the layout of this page. But you know, each page takes 3 to 5 hours to finish. So here's a finished one. And really it's just a matter of losing 20 minutes versus losing 5 hours. So that's how that works. Question number 2, you mentioned needing the reader to meet you halfway. How do you know when you need to give more to the reader in a book so as not to lose them versus when you say less and let them meet you? Also an excellent question. This goes back to kind of doing comics before March. I was doing a lot more fiction more regularly at that point, and my fiction has always been like fairly out there and ambitious and dreamy. But I really, before March, I never considered the potential readership of any book. And a lot of that was like a really snooty author attitude. And it showed how little I understood about how books get in people's hands. I really did have this assumption like, oh, the publisher prints the books, they wind up on bookshelves, people just wind up reading them, not recognizing that not only a lot of effort and dedication, but a lot of risk at times is taken by positive gatekeepers, by librarians, bookstore people, teachers, people who believe in the books they're reading. So thanks to March, and really thanks to a lot of, like, when I started doing March, I carried my own basic working knowledge of the civil rights movement, especially as like a Southern boy raised by Southern baby boomers. And I just truly assumed that everybody entered with the same basic working knowledge of the civil rights movement. And it took Andrew Aydin, the co-writer of March, and my editor to basically be like, trust me, they don't. But getting to see the impact between March Book 1 and March Book 2 made me really recognize that I need to step up explicitly to set up concepts with clarity and concreteness, and then I would not have to worry myself with those doubts. So after March, not only my fiction got even further out there, But thanks to having an awareness of needing concreteness and clarity, it didn't seem as far out there. And moving back into nonfiction, like Save It for Later, the question really is, for each scene or each moment, am I trying to communicate something about my family or me or my kid and our experience? Or am I trying to come from more of like a Rod Serling Twilight Zone second person narrative where, like, you know, maybe you have experienced this too. In those cases, I set up a scene which was subjectively true for me or for my family, but it's more about being able to place a line or two of text that will shift it from the first person into the second person, and that kind of hands it over to the reader. But a lot of it is like, yeah, do I want to make a specific point, or do I want to make a broader point that will allow a reader to be like, oh, this reminds me of this thing that happened. So I hope that answers the question.
Nate, I'm back on my mic finally, but
Oh, excellent.
I wanted to mention, I really enjoyed those moments you added into the book where you suddenly say to the reader, now, let's be honest, didn't you think that at that moment? I mean, you interject these little things, and it's wonderful little tool because it jolts you into a total immersion into the text. Suddenly your own personal experience is right there in your book. You know, it works really nicely.
Thank you. Well, some
yeah.
of that was a defense mechanism, actually. Basically, I guess re-entering a memoir, a nonfiction memoir comic that had political content, you know, there's a certain level of vulnerability where I was like, you know, other people can speak about a lot of this much better than I can. But at the same time, if what I'm talking about is how quickly normalization under authoritarianism has made us kind of shrug off some of this earlier stuff, and I can feel that in me too, then yeah, when I was in the writing stage or even the penciling stage, when I recognized that, like, oh, I'll bet you people are going to have a little attitude about this, like, one of the first scenes you're talking about here is in chapter 1, that has to do with getting a word about a very large local protest against the Muslim ban in late January 2017. And basically our family learning with about 2 hours notice that the assembly was happening downtown, being like, okay, we got to make some signs. And yet, you know, it's wholesome and cute because we're making signs with 5-year-olds, and basically just kind of checking in with how quickly the vividness of this and the conviction kind of gets swept under the rug. So it's like, do you remember how you felt in 2017? The intensity still ungovernable? Or just now, did you roll your eyes at my focus on feelings? Does airing these shared memories seem too much like bragging or shaming, or worst of all, nostalgia? It doesn't have to be. It's a reminder of what we can do together. So a lot of it is just like recognizing along the way where the weak spots or the openings for argument or dismissal might be in this book, and trying to be very upfront and kind of trying to match it with even more vulnerability, kind of exposing the flaws where possible, but recognizing that those vulnerabilities are their strengths when you realize they're broadly shared and it's a part of what we have all survived together.
Right. Now, this question came in, but it was also one of my questions, so I'll go ahead and ask it. This person asked, why are your children depicted with creature characteristics?
Very good question.
Yeah.
Okay, when I first got the idea for what became this book, I actually did an early cover and a couple of pages where my kids were just regular human kids, which was fine for me. But within a couple of months, I realized that a lot of this is like, I'm not interested in reading a book about my life. Mm-hmm. And I don't think anyone else should be either. But the purpose of storytelling, you know, through my and my family's experiences is not about our specific experiences. It is about that shared experience. So on one hand, there is the fact that if I anthropomorphize my kids into these weird like unicorn dogs or whatever they are.
They're adorable.
Well, thank you. They feel very true to the spirit of my kids. But by presenting my kids in this anthropomorphized way, a reader hopefully is not seeing my kids. They are seeing their kids or young people in their lives. To me, that was a really easy thing to help enrich that experience of reader projection. And really, that is one of the unique strengths of comics. So it was like a no-brainer to do that. The other side of that is just a basic consent issue. It's like, my kids have no ability to consent to this. And yet these things that I feel are important enough to put in a book for tens of thousands of people to read, it's an unavoidable complication. And so the easiest thing I could do is at least not present their likeness.
I thought it worked really well. It was odd. You'd have this moment of, oh, those faces aren't human. I mean, you actually almost don't notice it at first. But I think it works very well for your purpose there. There are a whole bunch of questions here from one person. Do you see the ones I'm looking at?
Oh, yes, I see.
Because they end up having more questions than I thought. So there's a list of them. You want to take some of those?
Oh, sure. I'll run through these real fast. You bet. And I can stay over a few minutes too, if that's necessary. So yeah, who or what have been your visual art and writing inspirations over the years? Visually, as a cartoonist, there's a huge part of me that is still predominantly influenced by 70s, 80s Marvel superhero artists. So even no matter what book I'm doing, there's a part of me that's always like Arthur Adams drawing an X-Men book in the 1980s. The more like indie comics, graphic novel focused side of me goes a whole range of influences. My fiction is more influenced by Charles Burns's Black Hole. I'm looking at my bookshelf here for easy reference. Gillian Tamaki, a total genius. Becky Cloonan is probably, and there's a new cartoonist just in the last few years who's been blowing my mind named Rosemary Valerio O'Connell. I think her work is absolutely beautiful. In terms of direct influences on this book, I'd say that the cartoonists who influenced me the most are a British guy named Daryl Cunningham, who wrote a book called The Age of Selfishness. He has a new book out called Billionaires. Sarah Glidden, she did a book that came out a few years ago called Rolling Blackouts. That's a hybrid of journalism and autobiography. Miriam Labicki, who is my peer and good friend and is sort of an under-recognized pioneer for my generation of the modern comics essay that's influenced by new journalism. She has a new book going on that she's doing right now. It'll be out next year, but her most accessible work is an essay collection called Toward a Hot Jew that reflects on culture, identity, and her experiences, both like political and personal crossovers in her experiences with her faith, with dual citizenship, and it's a fantastic read. And Ben Passmore, his book, Your Black Friend and Other Strangers. He also does awesome sci-fi comics, which I think are undercredited. So those are probably my biggest influences on the work that made Save It for Later.
Okay, then she has another question. Were there any challenges with illustrating for the March trilogy? I personally imagine it can be a satisfying creative challenge to illustrate a sequence of historical events you weren't around to witness, or capturing the feelings your collaborators had in the moment. So I wanted to hear about if you had any moments like that. Oh, yes.
So I drew March over the course of about 4.5 years. There were moments in which I realized, part of the reason why Congressman Lewis chose me to be the artist was by virtue of growing up in Alabama, in Arkansas. My family's from Mississippi, and having a baseline level of familiarity, not just with the history, but with the topography, the foliage, the food, the culture. So there were moments throughout the March trilogy where, like it's a balance of this like accurate, responsible storytelling that can get really finely tuned and required a lot of Google image searches, a lot of movie watching, getting tons of books of photography, and trying to find new ways to cover these moments that were separate from the ways we've seen hundreds of times from a certain camera's viewpoint. But there were these other moments where I had to kind of look in between the lines of the script for where I was more free in a non-verbal way to let my voice out as a cartoonist. So any moment in which I had a personal familiarity with or context for a particular setting, I really tried to lean on my own memories of that location, of that setting. And there were actually quite a good number of those throughout the March trilogy. So whenever possible, I was able to inject some sense of self. But a lot of it was, like slowly developing the skill set to know what I needed to reference and research for each panel on each page without it seeming too overwhelming. And let's move on to some other questions as well. Okay, yes, I use my own handwriting for the font of Save It for Later. I do everything physically on the page, in fact. A lot of this is just a product of my age. Like, I graduated from high school the year before there were any computers in my school. Graduated from college the year before computers were required for any cartooning students. So for me, it's much easier just to do it on the paper, and I save so much time. Whenever I have complicated corrections or some kind of work that needs to be done that's beyond just cleaning things up in Photoshop, I usually pass that over to my good friend Aaron Toby, also a former employee of the Monroe County Public Library, who has been my graphic design wizard and cohort for 15 years.
Wow. Very cool.
So let's see. As a parent, how do I put the events of January 6th in context for my children? And how much did I let them watch of it? Will it play a part in my future work? Well, it was, I think that I had arrived at a point, especially after working for the last few years on basically like trying to communicate the seriousness and the stakes of what was happening, while balancing it and trying to get better about not satisfying that urge to make things seem as scary as they are. I arrived at a point in which, because it happened during the school day, my kids were not home to see it live on TV. So it was a matter of recognizing by that point, like 4 years into this mess, that there wasn't any benefit for my 9-year-old at the time on the 6th or the 7th to see video footage as it was happening or right afterwards. So that's where I erred on the side of explaining it verbally, showing images, but also always trying to think ahead, think about how the spin mechanisms and how the reactionary political elements are going to spin something like the insurrection on January 6th. I was trying to think to the future. And to me, the most important part was not only to state plainly the purpose and the unfolding of events, but to iron in that this was real, which sounds absurd that we are in a place in which the most important thing you can do is try to undercut this plausible deniability and just try to establish a baseline of truth. So that was my primary focus regarding January 6th with my kids. I do bring it up every couple of weeks when I'm talking about something else with my 9-year-old. A lot of that is knowing that every single one of these issues, if you don't cover it all at some point, your kid's going to keep asking questions, or there will be another contextual connection. You're going to have endless time to keep on coming back around to it. So like, don't give a kid too much at one time for them to chew, because they're going to come back and you're going to be able to continue discussing it. Oh yeah, related to January 6th, did the images make you think about face? Because it seemed predictive of later events in terms of visuals. Yes, to me, I mean, this is not something that you like toot your horn about, but it was very obvious that what happened on the 6th was going to happen. as of November or December, it seemed very clear that a plausibly deniable coup attempt was going to transpire. And recognizing that aesthetically, it was an obvious confluence of so many of these stylistic elements shrouded by the plausible deniability of drawing lots of spectators and, relatively speaking, not civilians, but bystanders to the more organized, carefully planned insurrection itself. And so, yeah, to me, About Face was in the worst way possible, vindicated and validated on that afternoon. But sadly, this is the kind of thing that the reason I made About Face was because by the end of 2017, these signs of this aesthetic shift and its function politically and socially were so obvious to me that it was disturbing that, that no one, I couldn't find anyone who was speaking about these symbols and this aesthetic in the same way. And so there's a part of me that was like, well, it comes down to the comic book artist. But then again, if we're talking about symbols and pop culture, this is another moment for the strengths of comics. Yeah, perhaps comics were the ideal outlet for organizing these connections.
Yeah, when I got the book and I was going to read it, I knew what it was about, and I was almost reluctant to relive those years. I really, by a part of my healing is to move away from it a bit, right? So when I went back to read the book, I was grateful that you did what you did with it in terms of speaking about it through your children and how you worked with them in regards to what was going on. It gave a different approach to the subject matter that allowed me to sort of go through and relive it and think about it and have something to chew on without it just being a relentless reliving of what I felt. It gave me this format that it was actually enjoyable to read. So it's a very interesting book, and it's definitely worth reading and taking a look at. It's a wonderful read. So thank you for that.
Oh, thanks a lot. And I guess my only counterpoint there is that it's very natural, myself included, to balance that sense of needing a breather, needing to take a moment to actually savor what happens when society begins to function. But I want to stress, we're still living it. We're still in it. The rest of the 2020s, in my opinion, is still going to be in the previous 5 years. It depends, the survival of democracy will be determined by how much people get with the reality that we are still living within the authoritarian power grab that we were able to push aside, thankfully. For everyone's health, it's nice to be able to have enough safe spaces to get some of your life back. But it's important not to get too comfortable, because then it all goes away.
Right. It hasn't stopped.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Nate Powell, for being with us today. It's been absolutely wonderful. Remember, his book is available at the library, at the bookstore, at the library. And we want to thank the Monroe County Public Library, the best library in the whole state of Indiana. We want to thank the Friends of the Library Board of Directors for all the work they do to help support the library. And remember, everybody, you can become a friend of the library and get more involved in activities with the library, and we'd love for you to do that. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the Sunday.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.